Hi everyone, and welcome to your first Professor Musings. What I'm going to be doing is taking a deeper dive into the Stowers case. And my goal is to kind of walk you through the IRAC method, using many of the questions and type of analysis that I will use with each team during our individual chats. As I said before, I really like technology, and I'll be walking you through using Mind Manager. And as you see, I've actually done maps of two cases, the Stowers case and Hawkins v. McGee. For the purposes of the Professor Musings for this week, I will only be focusing on Stowers. So if you like the Mind Manager interaction, you might want to click through for the Hawkins v. McGee case. Now, Stowers is in our intentional torts chapter, and what we're going to be talking about really is the intentional tort of false imprisonment. And in beginning that conversation, I would always want to know what is the story or the background in this case. And here you'll see that the facts include the parties, and you have the plaintiff, Mrs. Stowers, and the defendant, the doctor who treated her. And given that she is suing, and this is actually on appeal, so she was successful during trial, and we'll see that the defendant, or in this case the appellant, who is asking the appeals court to hear the case again, is going to be appealing. But what happened? And there are a lot of facts here. And the version of the case as contained in your textbook kind of goes along the lines of the he said, she said. And given that it was in the actual 60s when the case took place, Ms. Stowers told her husband she wanted a divorce, and they'd had some marital complications. After that announcement, apparently the doctor came to the house and told her that he was coming to check on her husband's back. And according to her version of the story, he never identified himself as an actual psychiatrist. After they had had another bad interaction or marital discord, the police officers actually told her that perhaps she should speak to the therapist again. It was only at that time she learned that he was a psychiatrist. Now that's her version. His version is a little different. He said that her husband contacted him to examine her. And according to his recollection, at the time he arrived at the house, he told Miss Stowers that he was there to examine her and identified himself as a psychiatrist. Interestingly enough, during his deposition, and a deposition is taken during the pre-trial phase called discovery, where you are asked questions under oath. And the whole goal of discovery or deposition is to elicit from the person that you're deposing enough facts to substantiate the allegations that you've made in your complaint. Now, perhaps given that he was under oath, at that point he said he didn't exactly recall whether or not he had told her she was a psychiatrist. Either way, shortly thereafter, we see that the therapist and a Dr. Smike submitted sworn affidavits to the court that they had examined Ms. Stowers and that she was mentally ill. Interestingly enough, and this was possible in the late 60s, all of this happened without the plaintiff's knowledge or consent that she had been evaluated, that a sworn statement had been submitted to the court, and that she had been identified as mentally unstable. 4 days later, the probate court entered an order for temporary hospitalization of the plaintiff until her sanity could be determined. And she was committed to Ardmore Acres. And let's see if this link works. Yes, it does. So this is an actual photo of what Ardmore Acres, or the place where Miss Stowers was committed, looked like. Okay. While she was there, she refused treatment. She was placed in a security room for 6 days, and for 5 days, an additional 5 days, because she refused to eat. The doctor would phone in medications and visited her often. During that time, she made several requests to speak to her family and an attorney. All those requests were denied. She was eventually able to get access to an unsecured phone and called her children. When the therapist found out about that, he indicated that if she ever did that again, she would not talk to her family. She was forcibly medicated, and finally, after she was able to get in touch with her children and have them contact relatives, she was actually released from the court almost 25 days later. So that's the story of what happened, or the facts of the case that will substantiate Ms. Stowers' false imprisonment claim. Okay. So the procedural history. And by procedural history, what I mean here is, if you recall, this case is on appeal. She won at the trial court level. And the doctor is appealing the court's decision or determination. In other words, he thinks they got it wrong. So the procedural history in this case, other parties were dismissed, and that's not really germane to this. He filed for a directed verdict. And directed verdict means when you have a jury trial and you believe that, and the jury comes up with an answer, you can say, I'd like a directed verdict that they got it wrong as a matter of law. That's really beyond the scope of this course, but something that you might want to be interested in. The actual claims that she filed for were assault and battery, that being detained against her will, and the battery was being restrained and being forcibly medicated. The verdict, and you have verdicts when juries render the decision, and judgments when judges render the decision, was in her favor for $40,000. And again, he appealed because he thought that they got it wrong. So with that background, let's go into an actual analysis or critique of the case. And the first thing that you always want to focus on is, what does he want? And obviously he wants the verdict overturned. And on appeal, what is the specific issue that he would like the court to examine? In this case, he feels that there is insufficient evidence to support the jury's false imprisonment verdict. So the jury found that she was held with against her will, false imprisonment, and he is saying that there's not enough evidence to support that. So let's take a look at the analysis that the court goes through in determining whether or not the therapist should win on appeal. So just by going back to our IRAC method, we're familiar now with the story of how she was diagnosed and committed in large part without her knowledge and definitely without her consent. That she was able to finally obtain her release by finding an unsecured phone, and that she subsequently sued for false imprisonment, assault, and battery. What we're going to really focus on is the false imprisonment claim rather than the assault and battery. So, the analysis. It's always a good idea to start with the actual law. So what is the definition of false imprisonment? It is unlawful restraint of a person's liberty. How does that apply here? She was confined to Ardmore Acres against her will. In addition, they refused to allow her to communicate with her family or try to attain release. Now, that's her argument. Countering that is the therapist's argument. And what he says is all the actions that he took in this case, restraining her, denying her access to her family, to an attorney, is customary. That is the standard of care for dealing with psychiatric patients. And in his mind, if in fact his conduct met the standard of care, then there should be no finding of false imprisonment. Now, in the maps, when you see a little notepad like this, it gives you a far deeper analysis or definition of the legal principle. There's a lot to put in maps, so what I do is I add in or give you additional information. So when you see those, if you'd like to know more about the topic, I encourage you to click on them. So we have her statement that she was confined against her will. The therapist's take of, hey, this is what we do. This is standard procedure for treating a psychiatric patient. Now we're going to have the court's analysis. In this case, and if we go back to those ethical norms, freedom is an ethical norm that is of the utmost importance in our society. And the court finds that you have an absolute right to contact an attorney and to try and secure release. And what's interesting, oops, sorry about that. Looking at the court's take on false imprisonment, it takes a real critical look at psychiatrists. Specifically, it notices the uneven balance of power between a doctor and a patient. And more specifically, when someone has been committed, the psychiatrist has virtually unlimited power over the patient. So the court views its role as making sure that the individual's freedom is protected. And it's analogous to every person has a right to an attorney, and you have a right to an attorney to secure your release or your fair representation. And a similar argument can be made here. So, in this case, she has an absolute right, and the court must zealously guard her individual right to communicate with the outside world. And this is even done in habeas corpus cases. And again, I've given you a detailed analysis of the evolution of habeas corpus. If you're interested, I encourage you to read it. Okay, so from this we see that psychiatrists have an even higher duty to make sure that patients have access to communicate with the outside world. And when they fall below that standard of care, they have to answer to courts. And courts view a person's right to freedom as utmost, and as even goes so far as to make it analogous to a person who's been detained or arrested having a right to an attorney. So we've looked at the substantive rights, in this case, to contact an attorney to try and secure her release, and the role of physicians. Looking at that, and if you want to go back to the original definition of false imprisonment, if you remember, unlawful restraint of a person's liberty. And liberty is not, the court didn't look as hard as her physically being confined as her inability to access the outside world. When you look at that, the application of the facts in this case to the law, then the ultimate decision in this case, ruling in favor of Stowers, or putting it in more legal terms, upholding the jury's verdict that she was falsely imprisoned, makes a lot of sense. So there are some assigned questions that I put, and I encourage you to discuss them with your teammates if there are any specific questions about it, or in my analysis of this case. I encourage you to post it on the discussion board, and I look forward to talking with you more about it. Until the next Professor Musings, see you later.